is matched by a very small number of people. But I will give it a try. Now, Professor Andy Nathan is class of 1919 professor of political science at Columbia University. He has a BA, MA, and PhD from Harvard, where he studied with a great American historian on China, John King Fairbank. He has been at Columbia University since 1971, where he served as chair of the Department of Political Science, chair of the Executive Committee of the Faculty of Arts and Science. His long list of publications demonstrate the breadth and depth of his scholarly work. I will only mention some indicative titles of books he has co-authored, authored, or edited. Peking Politics, 1918-1923, Popular Culture in Late Imperial China, Human Rights in Contemporary China, the Tiananmen Papers, very impactful book, China's New Rulers, The Secret Files, China's Search for Security. His articles have appeared in top journals, including World Politics, the China Quarterly, the Journal of Democracy, Asian Survey, and elsewhere. And his research has been supported by the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Henry Luce Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Jiangxin Foundation, the Smith-Richardson Foundation, and many others. Professor Nathan, is a great honor for having you here in Athens, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Constance. I have developed laryngitis either because of air conditioning or because of the dust coming across the Mediterranean. So I apologize for that. I think it's going to be kind of unpleasant for you to listen to me, but I hope I have something to say that'll be interesting anyway, if you could sort of ignore the sound of it. I'm just very honored to be here, very pleased to be here. This is my second visit to Athens. The first time I came to Athens was in 1964. Socrates was walking around here. I went up to the Oracle of Delphi and had my future told. Those were the good old days. As I remember, there was no fee to enter the why am I blocking on the name? You know, yes, and you could just go up there and pull the marble all you want to do without touching it. That's my memory. I don't know if that's really true or not. I'm so excited about the project that Costas has started here in the IDIS. It's very important with China's tremendous amount of influence in Greece, that Greece has its own independent center to understand China. And I think your interest in coming to the lecture is a sign that his project is very timely. And you'll see quite soon, I think, that I don't represent the US government in any way. I'm an independent scholar and critical of everybody. I told the students this morning in this room, we had a meeting with the students, and I said that all, in effect, all governments are bad, all foreign policy is about power and so on. So I come from a realist school of international relations. The first slide, do you want to do the show screen here? You already shared it. Okay, so only I see the future slides. That's fine. The first slide is about a cover of a book that I published along with a co-author in 2012 called China's Search for Security. And this was just before Xi Jinping, thank you, before Xi Jinping came to power. And since Xi has been in power, China has been more assertive, I'll say. Some people use the word aggressive. But I still think that our theme, as it was indicated in the title of the book, is still accurate, which is that China's foreign policy fundamentally can be explained as a search for security. China is not a secure power. Of course, no power, even the United States, is 100% secure. But China has many sources of vulnerability for their national security. And I have a quote here from the intro to the book: vulnerability to threats is the main driver of China's foreign policy. I think that's still true. What are the threats to China's security as those are seen from China? And I think they're not wrong. I agree with them. But I try to explain U.S.-China relations by looking in the heads of Chinese policymakers and in the heads of American policymakers. And both sides have their fear of the other. In the case of China, we developed in this book the concept that China faces security threats in 4 concentric rings. And the first one is within the boundaries of China, as the boundaries of China are understood by the Chinese. So we can, in that sense, include Taiwan in that boundary and include the South China Sea in that boundary. In that, China regards these as part of its national territory, but the threats begin with the main heartland population of China, where the Han population, the majority, 94% of the population, lives in a relatively constrained space, because a lot of the Chinese map, which I really don't have a good picture of, which I have one in a later slide. You probably know that the main part of the population is concentrated in about 40% of the territory of China, and then the huge northwestern and western territories of Xinjiang and Tibet. You have a question? No, okay. If anybody wants to interrupt me, it's perfectly okay. Are much more thinly populated. In this Han heartland, China has succeeded in its project of modernization to a significant degree, not that they're finished with it. And in doing so, they have created a change in the Han majority population, which is the rise of a large middle class that has its own property, has apartments, has automobiles, sends its children overseas for study, travels overseas. And this large middle class, which is not the majority of the population, but it's 300,000 or 400,000 people, nobody has an accurate count of it, are much more difficult for the regime to control than was the case when China was a largely peasant population. So this middle class is a potential threat to the security of the regime. They're dissatisfied and they basically support the regime based upon economic prosperity, and the economy is slowing down. They have independent ideas of their own. And then as you move out to the western area and also around the ring and in the region next to Korea and the region next to Southeast Asia, you have these 55 designated national minorities, of whom the largest are the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, who are populations that are both very dissatisfied with the government in Beijing and don't fully accept the identity as citizens of China. So from China's, and these populations as well have cross-border relations. The Tibetans have the Dalai Lama in India, and the Dalai Lama is very popular in the United States and in Europe. The Uyghurs have expatriate populations in Kazakhstan and Germany and Washington, D.C. So the Chinese government regards these territories as not fully under its control. Then Hong Kong was another such place, which now seems to be fully under control after a big crackdown, the adoption of the national security law. Then Taiwan is part of Chinese territory, according to them. I'm not taking a position on that, but I'm trying to read their minds. That they don't control, and which represents an ideological threat. It represents a military threat. I'll come back to that. I'll explain it more. And the South China Sea, which is contested between China and especially the United States, but also other powers and the literal states that, such as the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on, that have Vietnam, that have their own claims there. So that's the first ring where the regime feels that we don't control our own territory and our own population. The second ring is, and I always compare with my students the United States. We have two neighbors, of course, Canada, Mexico, and two oceans. China, on the other hand, has 24 neighboring countries. And it doesn't really have securely good relations with any of these countries. We can talk about China's relations with Russia later. I don't want to take the time to go into it now, but my basic point is they don't trust each other and they never will, even though they now have an alliance of convenience. Then you have Japan, you have India, you have so big countries that are not inherently friendly to China, don't share Chinese culture, don't identify with Chinese civilization, and don't trust China. And then you have little countries like Vietnam, South Korea that are also want to be independent, don't want to be controlled by China. And then you have countries like Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, that are, sources of instability, especially a country like Myanmar, drug smuggling and so forth. So their immediate circumference is very difficult to control in a way that's not true of the United States. Now, you may think of the comparison with, let's say, with Greece, which historically has had all kinds of struggles with neighbors, but you don't have 24 neighbors, and none of them is Turkey is the largest of those. Which is, well, I don't want to get it, but I mean, perhaps China's just security situation in the periphery is worse than that of Greece and certainly worse than the United States. And then we say in the book that the third ring of threats are the regional complexities. So Southeast Asia, 10 countries with all of their internal struggles. So they Northeast Asia with the North Korea, South Korea, Japan situation, but I'll show on the next slide the United States role in that third ring. And finally, so can we see this? Let's see the title. Actually, there's a way of that's good. Well, there's a slide. There's a we're going in the wrong direction. Yeah, that's an implement. But the fourth ring of Chinese security threats has to do with their intense interdependence with the global economy, but their lack of control over the sea lanes of communication that could be interrupted as for example, oil crosses the Indian Ocean. It could be interrupted even by the Indian Navy and certainly by the American Navy and the British Navy if we wanted to interfere with it. And then their supplies go through the Strait of Malacca, which is controlled by the neighboring states, Singapore and Malaysia, and with Japanese assistance and American assistance. So the Chinese do not yet control their access to the global economy, which is so important for their domestic stability because they have to keep raising the living standards of the middle class and using their international trade profits to build up their military. And then when they look around the region, the one common theme they see in everything is the United States, the threat of the United States. So the United States, starting with the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, has been hostile to, has been a threat to the self-defined security interests of the government in Beijing. So first in the 1950s and 60s, we had the policy of containment of China, and then we had a friendly period with China after the Nixon and Kissinger visits, but that friendly period was based on the assumption by the United States that China would become a friend of ours and that they would accept American dominance of the international system, which is not acceptable to the government in Beijing any more than it's acceptable to any other government in the world. And we continue to have, go back to that slide, to have our deployments all around China. Now, this picture is a little bit out of date because we don't have troops in Afghanistan anymore. You can also question, I mean, the utility of our alliance with Pakistan. We have a treaty alliance with Pakistan that isn't worth anything. But the big picture is that around the coastal area, not the land, not the Russia border, to be sure, and not the India border either, but around the coastal border of China, the United States has always maintained very extensive deployments. Those deployments are changing in a way that actually increases the threat to China. I'll talk about that in a moment. Now we can go to the next slide. Now, Chinese often ask, why is the United States interfering in Taiwan, which is, 10,000 miles away? And you've seen the US government repeat that the United States is a resident Pacific power, which is saying that our interest in the Pacific is legitimate, Washington, D.C. claims. But the Chinese say Taiwan is our historical territory, and it's close to us, and people living there are Chinese. And why are you interfering? Well, are we interfering? And the answer is yes, because the United States is the only reason why China has not long since taken control of Taiwan. And that was originally a defense treaty that the United States had with Taiwan. And after that defense treaty was terminated, when the United States established diplomatic relations with Beijing, the US then adopted something called the Taiwan Relations Act. Even before that, in the Shanghai Communique and subsequent communiques, the United States stated that we have a national interest in the so-called peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue. And in defense of that stated national interest of the United States has armed Taiwan, has deployed our own troops to deter a Chinese military attack on Taiwan. And Taiwan has evolved into a country with a strong self-identity as separate, politically Chinese identity, but separate from the People's Republic of China. And there are a number of reasons for the US interest in Taiwan. And keep it there for the moment. So I'm always criticized in my teaching at Columbia that I have too much text on my PowerPoint. So, and I haven't been able to correct myself. So I thought this time I'm going to have not much text, but that means that a lecturer doesn't know when to switch to the next slide, and I have fewer slides, so I'll talk longer time for each slide. But if you look at this map on the left, you see something called the first island chain. So it goes from Japan, and then the map doesn't show this maybe as clearly as possible, but Japan is in possession of a string of islands that go south and come, pretty close to Taiwan. And then there's Taiwan, and then there's Philippines, which is a long series of islands. And then there is Malaysia and Vietnam. So the whole South China Sea, the whole coast of China, and I could include South Korea, should include South Korea there. The Chinese Navy is bottled in this so-called first island chain and cannot freely come and go. Now they've developed a blue water navy that can sail all the way out, and that's why I wanted to show this second picture here. If the Chinese Navy could come in and out from the China coast as freely as they want to, there's really nothing between them and San Diego, where the United States has a huge naval base. There are a number of US islands, and the most important of which is the island of Guam, which has a gigantic naval and air base. But they really would be able to roam the high seas at liberty. And that would, working in a long-term perspective, that would represent a threat to the United States and to our allies. So the only place where China can break through this first island chain is Taiwan. There's a strait on the north and a strait on the south of Taiwan. The other countries, the Philippines, Japan, and so forth, they're not going to not easily come under the control of China. I suppose in 100 years, I might come back to Athens and say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And the Philippines has become an ally of China. But, you know, it's not a near-term solution to the problem. So the Chinese interest, I mean, I could have another slide. What is the Chinese interest in Taiwan? It's a historical interest. It's an ideological and political interest. It's an economic interest in the advanced chip fabs in Taiwan. But I emphasize this geostrategic interest. China needs, if I were the president of Taiwan, even though I'm sorry, of China, even though I'm a nice guy and I'm not Xi Jinping, I would want to control Taiwan because I need my Navy to come in and out. And that's the exact reason why the United States doesn't want to give up Taiwan, though we also have other reasons, including ideological reasons and economic reasons and reasons of the so-called rules-based international order. Now, I think, let's see the next slide. Okay, let's go back again. So for many, many, many years, the United States military strategy for deterring. So the Chinese have always said, this is our territory. We prefer a peaceful solution to the issue of Taiwan's inevitable unification with the People's Republic of China, with the motherland. However, we reserved the right for a military solution, but China didn't have a military solution until quite recently. But they have recently achieved, through tremendous investments in their military, a military option, which has to do with a suite of accurate missiles and submarines that could sink American aircraft carriers. Of course, it's a gamble, but the Pentagon believes that they could sink an American aircraft carrier, in which case you lose 5,000 to 7,000 U.S. Sailors and airmen. And they have missiles that can bomb the big air base in Guam and the air bases, several air bases in Japan. So the think tank people and the academics in the United States have been saying for 10 or more years that the Pentagon needs to change its war strategy in for the Taiwan contingency by dispersing our forces, having many, many more small units. You don't have one big aircraft carrier that's, you know, has a target on it. You have many smaller craft and smaller bases. And just last week, but I don't know what goes on in the Pentagon. I think some of my colleagues who are more clued in have known this. But just last week, both the New York Times and the Financial Times published information and maps that said, yes, the Pentagon has, in fact, developed more dispersed forces. They're based in islands in the Philippines. They're based in additional Japanese islands. They've trained marine units that are very small, that can move around, that have 150-mile missiles that can sink Chinese ships and so forth. So as China ramps up its what we call asymmetric strategy, like you have aircraft carriers, we have missiles, the Pentagon is responding. I think it's a characteristic of United States China policy and probably United States foreign policy in general, with apologies to my colleagues from, not my colleagues, but my fellow country persons from the embassy. It's a characteristic of American foreign policy to react too slowly and to be complacent, but it does react eventually. So I just wanted to point out that the U.S. deployment is changing, and the deterrent, I think, we'll see, deterrent significance of this is going to be significant, large, and that it means that a Chinese attack on Taiwan, this is another Q&A thing we can talk about, is probably not imminent. Okay. Yes. So it just so happens that, not only did Xi Jinping visit Serbia and all that, everything is very timely, but also the new president of Taiwan, who was recently elected, took office on May 20th. What day is today? I can't keep track, but it is, 2 days ago. Okay, I once when I'm traveling, I don't know what day it is. And so we were all waiting for his inaugural address to see what because this guy, Lai Ching-te, was a long-time Taiwan independence person. And if the new president of Taiwan would do something dramatic to promote the de jure independence of Taiwan, this might force the Chinese government to launch a military attack. Now, China's strategy around Taiwan is very subtle, so I don't have time to go into it totally, but they're sort of tightening the noose around Taiwan with all kinds of gray zone tactics, as they are called, ships and planes, and disinformation efforts and so on. But that is short of a crisis. Now, traditionally, the U.S. Mission called what is it called, Shanna? The American AIT, the American Institute in Taiwan, advises the new Taiwanese president in tremendous detail about the script for his inaugural address. And I think the key sentence in the inaugural address was this one, which basically repeats the position of his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, whom Washington, D.C. liked, because Tsai Ing-wen was careful not to provoke an attack from Beijing. So Beijing does not trust this guy at all. But he has refrained from sort of shed his historical hard line on Taiwan independence in order to embrace the moderate line of his predecessor. I also want to point out that the VP is a Columbia graduate, Shelby Kim. She was my advisee back in the day. She was an MA student at Columbia. But she doesn't write. She doesn't call. I don't know. She's not loyal. No, but she before being chosen as the VP, she was Taiwan's ambassador in Washington, and she was incredibly well appreciated in Washington. She was the most trusted of any Taiwanese ambassador. You know, we don't have formal diplomatic relations, so they're not formally an ambassador, but they occupy the position of an ambassador called a representative. And so the choice of her as the VP was another sign as well that the new administration was going to pursue a non-provocative line. The 4 commitments are sort of an obscure thing, but I put them on the slide just in case. Okay, in case you want to know. Okay, let's go. So when it comes to U.S.-China relations, I've organized my slides more from I want to talk about both sides, and I've talked about China's security concerns vis-a-vis the United States, but looking from China's point of view, why does the United States insist upon something called the rules-based international order, which from China's point of view is just an American-dominated order where the United States creates the rules and then violates the rules as it wishes, but punishes others who don't violate the rules. So there are many examples of this, but the South China Sea is a very good example. So there is something called the UN UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea says that countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and so forth have significant exclusive economic zones. And China is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And the United States is not a signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea because the United States possesses, until recently, the dominant navy in the world and the Senate majority did not want to ratify a treaty that would limit the operations of the U.S. Navy to do whatever it wanted to do any place in the world. But we have so the U.S. takes the position that we want you to comply with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And China takes the position that historically, before the establishment of the People's Republic of China in the 1920s and 30s, when the South China Sea was just being explored and nobody really had mapped it, that our fisher people got there first. We were on this island and this rock and this sandbar and so forth before anybody else. And we have a map, China says, from 1946, the previous government of China, that shows that we claim basically this red line. They don't draw a red line, they draw a series of dotted lines called the 9-dash line. It used to be called the 11-dash line. But they settled 2 of the dashes with Vietnam, so they took those dashes off of their map. So the Philippines, so China's territorial claims in the South China Sea are extremely broad and really don't comply with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And so the Philippines was threatened by these claims, and the Philippines has a very small Navy, and the Chinese Navy is much bigger. So the Philippines sued China before the UNCLOS tribunal, and China lost and the Philippines won. But China then said that when we signed the UNCLOS, we took a reservation that said we don't accept the jurisdiction of this tribunal. So the U.S. interest in the rules-based international order is that of course, the rules-based international order includes trade law, it includes maritime law, it includes human rights law, it includes aviation law, it includes all kinds of laws that in the past the U.S. was an influential, I wouldn't say the U.S. just unilaterally created all of these treaties, but it was very influential in the creation of these rules. And as with any country, you're negotiating them that look to its own interests. So that is, the U.S. wants to protect those rules, and the Chinese government wants to interpret. The Chinese government does not say there's no rules-based order. The Chinese government says the other rules are more important. For example, the UN Charter that says that there should be no interference in matters that are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of a state. That's a rule that the Chinese government approves of because of the previous slide about the 4 wings of security. So I don't think we can say that there is a fixed set of rules and that one country is correct and the other country is wrong. I think what we have to say is that there are disputes over which rules matter and what they mean. And each country interprets international law to its own interest, including trade law, for example, which I don't plan to talk about. The next area, so there are really 4 areas of competition between China and the United States. One is geostrategic. One has to do with the interpretation of international law and norms, some of which are not in treaties, but are just norms of international law, such as norms of reciprocity and so on. Can the U.S. sanction other countries? That's an interference in sovereignty, things like that. The third area of competition is in the tech area. So the graphic on the left is that China adopted about 10 years ago or so, a program called Made in China 2025, and they identified these 10 areas in which they wanted with state guidance, because the Chinese economy is state guided. It's not a classical Soviet planned economy, but it's an economy in which the state has dominance and investment power and controls the banks. China said these are the 10 areas where we want to achieve global leadership. And the United States first started to look at these things and said, well, you're never going to do it. We're the United States. I remember some years ago, I forget how many, maybe 15, I was in Germany and I was at a dinner with a representative from the German BASF chemical factory. And I said, a company, and he said, we're manufacturing, I think it was high-end paints in China. And I said, aren't you concerned that the Chinese will learn the technology for these paints to take over that market? And he said, they'll never master this technology. Well, they mastered all of these technologies. It's a big mistake to underestimate the technological learning level of China. They're not ahead in everything, but they are so much ahead, as you know, in the electric vehicle and in the batteries and in the supply chain for the chemicals that go into those batteries, lithium. What's the other one? I forget the name. What begins with a C. So eventually the United States is waking up slowly. So Trump, first of all, said, I'm just going to put tariffs on everybody, which was not a very, strategic way of handling it. But as you know, the Biden administration has now pursued a kind of dual track of putting 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, while at the same time investing a huge amount of money in the domestic manufacturer. We'll see how that goes, or whether it can be profitable, because in a market economy, somebody has to make a profit. That's not true in the Chinese economy. Investing in battery and EV manufacture, and we're trying to protect our high-end computer chips. And what I read is that is very leaky, and the Chinese have found ways to get a hold of those chips. So the U.S. is coming to this battle quite late, and China has tremendous momentum. But who cares? So the reason that the United States or China cares about this is, just take the example of EVs. For whoever manufactures the better EVs at the better price is going to, first of all, earn a huge amount of money that the other countries won't earn. Secondly, it's going to set the technological standard that even if you want to produce these EVs, you have to have the same technology. And thirdly, as you know, these EVs are spying on you. Every EV is a computer on wheels that's sending information back to somebody. And it's a huge intelligence benefit. If not for China, then for the United States. As a US citizen, I can assure you that if you use an American EV, the American car will spy on you just as much as the Chinese car. But we would rather spy on you instead of having somebody else do it. Okay, next. And then what is the US interest in human rights? So US foreign policy is probably not as effective. And now, when we talk about human rights, there are kind of two sectors in the United States. There's government and there's civil society. And civil society, NGOs, push human rights. I can't say that, it's a losing battle when you do human rights advocacy with respect to China. You don't really get any place. We used to get someplace when China was much weaker and more economically dependent on the United States for investment and trade and so forth. But now you don't. But the NGO community is pretty, aggressive or on this, and criticizes the U.S. government for not doing enough. But among the governments in the world, the U.S. government is the one that issued a statement noting the 35th anniversary of the Tiananmen crackdown. Issued a statement about the arrest of this person or that person, the disappearance of this journalist, Zhang Jian, who was reporting in Wuhan. The U.S. government does this, and it sanctions people. It places sanctions, for example, on officials who the U.S. government has ascertained are complicitous in the crackdown in Xinjiang. And those people laugh at these sanctions. It's like, I don't have a bank account in the United States. I'm not traveling to the United States, but they are sanctions. And the Chinese wondered, why do you care? And it's actually a hard question to answer. because all of my analysis up until this moment is realpolitik, right? But this is not, this can be understood as realpolitik, which is, it's a weakness of China. It's a kind of attack on China. It appeals to some, I mean, it makes the Chinese population, I mean, to some small extent, doubt the legitimacy of their own regime and so on. But it's not really realpolitik. This is the other strain of American foreign policy, which is values and idealism, which really exists. And it exists, it's not only the civil society pressuring the US government, it's actually officials in the US government who actually care about these things. The Chinese perceive it as a systems competition. Which form of government is better? I have Chinese students who come to me and say, I thought democracy was better, but now that I'm in the United States, I'm having my doubts. Maybe authoritarianism is better. And I tell them both of them are no good. Next slide. Because both forms of government don't really work. I think this is the next to last slide. I know, talking too long as usual. So Trump's policy on, if we go back to Obama was the time when the United States began to doubt that before Obama, the position of the United States, starting with Nixon, was that a prosperous and stable China is in the interests of the United States. And this was the idea of engagement. We're going to engage with you. We're going to trade with you. You're going to develop a middle class. Your students are going to come to Columbia University, and then you're going to love us because we are lovable. I think all great powers have this same idea. If you know me, you will love me. The Chinese have that point of view. The Russians have that point of view. The Americans have that point of view. The Greeks, some of the great powers have this point of view. Because I know from an American point of view, we think, yes, the United States has dominated the world for X number of decades, and why don't you like that? It's in your interest. We're not hurting you in any way. We expected the Chinese to love us. That was naive. Under Obama, we began to realize that the Chinese were not necessarily going to love us forever. And Obama engineered this thing called the pivot to Asia, but we still hope, when you see us pivoting to Asia, you'll get the message and then we can be back on the right track. And then Trump came in and he ran for office demonizing China, saying China's eating our lunch. China's going to overrun us and stuff like this. And so, and came in and slapped these tariffs on China, but didn't really have a strategy. The Biden administration came in and the main person engineering U.S.-China policy is a guy named Kurt Campbell, who has served in and out of the government under different presidents and was, in my opinion, a very smart guy, And before he went into the Biden administration, he and Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor, published an article in Foreign Affairs magazine where they said that, we should have a strategic competition with China. It's not a confrontation. There are areas where we need to cooperate, areas where we need to speak truth to the Chinese and lay down our core interests and so forth. And then just most recently, he made this statement after having a meeting with Ma Jiaoshu, the executive vice foreign minister, who came to Washington, and Kurt Campbell, the State Department readout was that we want to maintain open lines of communication and responsibly manage competition, but increasingly this strategy of responsibly managing competition so there isn't a tragic clash between the two countries that would be disastrous for the whole world and for the world economy and everything else. is being challenged by other people, and this is an example of it in the current issue of foreign affairs. Matt Pottinger, who was Trump's deputy security advisor, and Mike Gallagher, who was just retired from the House of Representatives, but while he was in the House of Representatives, chaired something called the Congressional, what was it called? The Joint Committee on China. That was heard witnesses talking about how bad China is and how big the China threat is. These two guys, who were both ex-Marines, published this article called No Substitute for Victory, in which they said it's not about managing the competition. It's about winning. It's about investing in military assets in Asia that will convince the Chinese never to move any troops and to stop building their military, that it's hopeless. And it's about encouraging the forces in China that want a better form of government. They don't say the US government should go into Beijing and overthrow the Communist Party, but they have a paragraph where they basically say things will be settled down when the Communist Party is gone. So if we go back to the first or the second slide, where we're talking about what is China's sense of threat, as this relationship evolves, the sense of threat on both sides is ramping up. And although there's a debate in the American political system over China policy, the old point of view that we used to call the panda huggers, which is we can get along with China, we can make money in China, there's no reason for any antagonism, that has really disappeared. And the spectrum has sort of moved to the right with the Campbell position of responsibly managing competition as the most soft line that exists, while many in Congress, many in the human rights community, many in the trade and investment community are saying China's going to take over the world in some sense. Some years ago, there was a book called by Martin Jakes, a British Marxist or ex-Marxist, I'm not sure what it's called, When China Rules the World. And people are now sort of envisioning a world that China rules in some sense. So if Biden, the last slide is to say, if Biden were to be elected, so people sometimes say, what do you do? I say, oh, I'm in political science. And then they say, oh, well, who's going to win the American election? I always say, I don't know that. I can tell you who's going to win the Chinese election, okay? Because I specialize in a simple political system. But we really don't know whether Biden or Trump is going to win the election. And if Biden wins the election, I would anticipate the policy will continue as it is. But if Trump wins the election, he is not a strategist and not a disciplined policymaker. So in his previous term, the top, I have the book, The Art of the Deal, in the top picture, relatively early in Trump's term in office, he visited China and he was very, very well treated by Xi Jinping. And to Trump, that's what matters. I was shown respect. I was treated like the mafia boss that I am. And I was taken to the Forbidden City and I saw, wonderful things. And so we're gonna make a deal with Xi Jinping and we get each other. So we're gonna make a deal. And then after a while, when Xi Jinping didn't perform according to Trump's demands, he changed his position and he slapped these tariffs on China, which didn't work very well because they weren't designed very well. So if Trump comes in, nobody knows what he's going to do, but what he's saying in the campaign is, I'm going to be much tougher on China than Biden is. If that were to happen, if he were to come into office, I think the main thing that we need to look at is the effect of his presidency on the American alliance system. I didn't go into this in detail, but part of the Biden strategy is to restore our alliances and improve our alliances vis-a-vis their ability to cooperate in containing China. And he's been quite successful in that effort. But the allies cannot trust Trump. And so this would really, I think, weaken. So on the one hand, Trump will be tougher on China, but on the other hand, I think it will weaken the American ability to compete with China and to deter Chinese efforts around Taiwan in whatever form those take. Okay, I finished more time than I should, but I look forward to your comments and people's comments and questions.
Thank you, Professor Nathan, for your very thought-provoking lecture. Now we'll pass the floor to Professor Papasteriou for a comment and a question.
Thanks for a great presentation. Very clear strategic point of view. Let me say that we have two superpowers. We are bound to have some kind of competition. So even if China will become democratic, that doesn't mean necessarily that there would be no competition between them. But still, ideological diversity complicates things. In the 1990s, we had there was a prevalent view that globalization, interdependence, the rise of the middle class gradually transformed China, but with Xi Jinping, China has been going in the opposite direction. So things are, China is moving away from Western values and has become more powerful and is leading now the bloc that some describe as the global south, or trying to lead the global south. On the other hand, as you clearly showed, the United States can exploit all these problems that China's, India, Japan, South China. So the United States is in a very advantageous position. Now, let me go to the Allison argument. It says that great power wars take place when a rising power threatens the established power. But this has happened 12 out of 16 times in modern times, modern era. I think it's very important, the last point you made, that it's not correct to compare, let's say, American GDP with Chinese GDP. And say that when Chinese GDP overtakes, if it has not already overtaken, depending on how you measure. But when it overtakes American GDP, then there will be this dynamic, this so-called facilities trap. But the United States, not alone. China has how many allies? Like North Korea, Russia, circumstantially, not the long run. Because the United States' alliances all over the world, very firmly rooted alliances. So it seems to me that as long as the United States keeps these alliances, and as long as the global south does not coalesce, and the global south is very diverse. If you look at BRICS, include India, which is chief regional rival of China and rising fast as well. And so long as the West remains united, and so long as the global south does not coalesce around China and Russia, then I think the United States have the upper hand. Okay. Do you think that there is a serious possibility that Western alliance will decline if Trump gets re-elected?
Well, okay. Well, let's look at it. Let's look on the pessimistic side. I mean, one doesn't know for sure. Well, first of all, let's leave Trump out of it for a moment. Let's say that China seems to, let's talk about Taiwan as an example of this. China is uh, moving its ships and planes closer to Taiwan more frequently is constraining Taiwan's diplomatic relations. There is the president of Taiwan is a member of the pro, what has traditionally been the pro-independence party, but the other main party, the Kuomintang, believes that the threat from China is very dangerous, and that Taiwan should find a way to accommodate with mainland China and arrange some maybe confederal system or something where Taiwan retains its autonomy within a larger China and so on. So supposing that either the Taiwanese public becomes afraid enough of China to negotiate, this wouldn't be tomorrow, over the course of the political process, to negotiate some kind of an agreement with China that says, let's get rid of the United States. China's very big, it's not going away. We have to find a way to work with China. And then China has access through the first island chain, and the United States could do nothing about that in that situation. Or supposing that China launches a military attack, which I don't think is likely in the foreseeable future, but supposing that it does, and the United States says, we have our Marines in the Philippines and we want them to sink some Chinese ships, and the then president of the Philippines says, I don't want you sinking Chinese ships off of my territory. And Japan might say that, and South Korea might say that. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that the United States is in such a secure position. Let's take the example of Greece. How secure of a position. So on the one hand, and I've been trying to learn about this while I'm here with conversations with people. So Greece is a member of NATO, it's a member of the EU, it's a member of the Eurozone. It has one or more than one large American naval base, more than one, several naval bases here, and other kinds of bases. Tell me on the map. And so you know, how secure, how complacent can the United States be about, let's say, Greece not using Huawei equipment as a NATO member, or not opening its market to Chinese electric vehicles and so on? I don't think that China's economy, as you said, is it already the largest economy in the world? Not per capita, certainly, but no. But and is it still growing or not? We don't know. The U.S. economy is doing very well with a growth rate. What is the American growth rate? I forget. Last time I looked, 3.5. And if China is growing at 5.2%, which they claim, and I don't know if it's true or not, then they're growing faster than the so. And so just between you and me, I'm not sure that the U.S. can afford to be as complacent as you're suggesting. But aside from you and me, in the American political system, the panic over the rise of China is growing. A lot of it has to do with this thing that MIT economist, I think his name is David Autor, called China shock, which was that when China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, the U.S. manufacturing sector lost a huge number of jobs. And it's very hard to bring that manufacturing sector back to life. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so, yeah, enough said. So I think, yeah, the political fact is that China panic is growing in the United States, even if it shouldn't be.
Professor Simon is authored an excellent book on the ARI,
Yeah,
which suggested the fears of this in the West are very exaggerated.
Yes, that's true. I think there is a tendency to brand risks and challenges as threats, And I think that undermines our ability to be analytical and to identify what is real, what's not. Also to have, our other countries take us seriously about what we're afraid of. Good. So I would like to invite questions from the audience. If we take okay, good. So the gentleman over here. Excellent presentation. The mic, is it a mic on? Is the microphone on? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. It's no problem. Very much for this excellent presentation. My name is Brian Santinos, and I'm currently a PhD student in Atlantic West. My question is the following. What's the current population of China, and how should we be able to compete with the US Pacific Fleet? Also, regarding the emerging and strategic technologies, which of the two countries, US or China, has the best? Thank you very much. The current capabilities of China, what are they? How long will it take them? How long will it take them to be able to match the US Pacific Fleet?
You're what was the other question about technology?
Regarding emerging and disruptive technologies. Which of the two countries has a head start?
Oh, I see. Yes. Okay. So with respect to the two navies, I think it's important to understand that the two navies' missions are not the same. So the U.S. Navy mission is global. It's the Persian Gulf. It's everywhere in the world. While the Chinese Navy's primary objectives now is the battle over Taiwan, if that takes place. And the Chinese Navy has more ships than the American Navy. And in a battle over Taiwan, it will operate closer to its shores. There was a time when the U.S. strategy to deter Chinese Navy was to bomb Chinese airfields and naval bases, but people realized that was escalatory. We would be bombing Chinese territory, and the Chinese have a nuclear deterrent, and that would, we don't know their nuclear strategy, but that would very likely include a Chinese nuclear response. So the U.S., as far as I know, no longer has a strategy to bomb Chinese bases. It can only sink Chinese ships, but China has a lot of ships. They have 2 aircraft carriers now, and they're building a third one. I'm not an expert in this, but I believe that their aircraft carriers are very inferior to the advanced American aircraft carriers. But the trouble is that the American aircraft carriers are extremely vulnerable. They travel with an aircraft carrier strike group that is supposed to defend them any attack, but now the Chinese can attack the aircraft carrier with a missile or with a submarine. Chinese quiet submarines have gotten through, have surfaced near aircraft carrier, and also they have torpedoes that can go a very long distance. So I think if you draw the comparison, Pentagon publishes an annual report on the People's Liberation Army, and they have said for many years that the Chinese forces, missile navy, and others to hold it. The phrase is hold at risk of American naval assets in Asia. So that's the comparison that I would draw. In terms of disruptive technologies, my understanding is that the United States has a significant lead in artificial intelligence. But as I said with this example of the BASF from many years ago, that it would be a mistake to think that the Chinese can't catch up. They have lots of very brilliant computer scientists. Let's take these advanced chips that to the surprise. So when the United States put a ban on the export of advanced chips to China, it was believed that Huawei could not produce the highest end telephones, but then Huawei came out with telephones that are apparently as high end as the highest end American cell phones. So they somehow managed to either work with slightly less advanced chips, but make them function at the same level, or they were able to import chips despite the ban. And they have so many computer scientists and so much raw data, because AI works with data, and they have all the data from the 1.4 billion Chinese people. There's no data secrecy in China the way that there supposedly is in Europe. I don't know if I should believe that or not, but yeah, so I wouldn't, so the US is ahead in that disruptive technology, but not necessarily, shouldn't, not necessarily forever. It's a real, it's a constant race. That's a great way. I think that China has the authoritarian type of system has, with respect to policymaking, has a number of risks. One is information, that if one leader has too much power, first of all, the information may be falsified. People don't want to tell him the truth. Secondly, he can't integrate all the information. Third, if a single point of failure, nobody can come in and say, no, you're making a mistake, or, the Congress or the media exposing what. So I agree with you that the vulnerability of the Chinese system to policy errors is a structural vulnerability which has occurred in the past. It occurred under Mao, for example, the Great Famine of the late 1950s, the Cultural Revolution, arguably the Sino-Soviet split, which was, created by Mao, things like that, were policy errors. However, I was saying earlier today, the meeting with Plum and Costas, I think that so far, Xi Jinping has been pretty smart. Because he's changed the status quo around Taiwan, he's changed the status and deterred Taiwanese independence, changed the status quo around Japan, around the Senkaku, he's changed the status quo in the South China Sea, launched the Belt and Road Initiative, which has given him a lot of influence, or given China a lot of influence around the world. Now, is he in the process now of making a big mistake, either with the, was it a big mistake to do the COVID lockdown? Was it a big mistake to eliminate the COVID lockdown overnight? Was it a big mistake? Is it now a big mistake to try to make the Chinese economy recover by exporting the way? We can argue about those things, but I would say that so far, Xi Jinping has been smart. I don't like Xi Jinping, but I respect what he's done so far. And then with respect to corruption, although we have no way of totally knowing this, but everything I hear from Chinese people is that he has, with his anti-corruption campaign, has significantly reduced the extent of corruption in China, because officials are afraid to accept bribes because of this anti-corruption campaign that's been going on. So I agree with you that this is a structural risk, but it seems to me that so far China, now why, you ask, why is China different? And I don't know the answer to that.
It's hard to say. I want to know why not mention this initiative that's going on is now. Do you think it wants substance? Is way China able to rest of the world? Is it kind of threat to this?
The Belt and Road Initiative is very important. It's a presence in about 100 countries, as far as I know. And the response to it varies in different countries. In some countries, it's associated with corruption. In some countries, it's associated with one party in the government and the opposition is against it. In some countries, it's associated with environmental damage and so forth. But by and large, I think the Belt and Road Initiative has purchased, increased China's economic security because it has gotten China access to mines and resources and transport routes and helped make China more central in the global economy, and has given China a significant amount of diplomatic influence where governments are inclined to cooperate in rules-based international order disputes in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations and places like that. So I do think it's very important, although it's not 100% success. The United States has failed to compete in those countries. So, for example, George W. Bush. So when you look at Africa, it seems to me that US and European policies in Africa are failing. This is a very broad statement. And that China has much more influence in Africa. Now, one might say, who cares about Africa? But they have one country, one vote in the United Nations, in the Human Rights Council. Africa is one of the 5, groupings of countries. And Africa's economy in general, most of the continental economy is increasing, and in years to come, it should be in natural resources, including the resources in the Congo that are essential for batteries and so forth. So Africa really is important, but the United States has not competed. George W. Bush had this program called the PEPFAR, the President's Emergency, what was it called? President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief. It's a great program, aiding African countries to combat AIDS. Successful. But compared to the scale of the Belt and Road, very small and niche, and not kind of material politically. I think the Bush administration had something wrong. What was it? They had a program to encourage private capital to invest in Africa. I forget the name of that program. Pompeo had that program under Trump. And, private capital, basically, if it's going to invest in Africa, it's going to invest in Africa anyway, because it expects to make a profit. It's not that the Chinese government can make investment happen in Africa the way that the US government cannot do. So I feel like on that particular aspect of Belt and Road, the US doesn't have a good answer to it. First of all, about the middle class. So I think the middle class in China, it's complicated. I agree with you that their support, that they support the regime because of economic growth. The middle class people today, their parents or their grandparents lived in poverty. In the space of how many decades is it since 1980s, 90s, 40 decades. The lives of these people have changed so dramatically, and they thank the government for that, appropriately so. The government engineered this. And if the growth rate, but now there's a youth unemployment problem. There is the government doesn't trust private entrepreneurs. There's this real estate problem where many middle class people have paid a lot of money for real estate, for apartments that have lost value or which haven't even been completed yet, and you're still paying a mortgage on an apartment that hasn't been completed. And the middle class is aware of the intense surveillance and social control, and they sort of live under that system. I mean, day to day, you live under the system, just like you and I live under the system of Microsoft and Facebook and everything. We don't like it, but we live under it. And we don't rise up against it. But the support of the middle class is somewhat fragile, especially on the economic side. So I agree with you. And this could be one of the big mistakes of Xi Jinping to try to manufacture his way out of the economics because it's producing a protectionist reaction around the world. The Chinese, I think, attitude about this protectionist reaction is it's a lot of smoke and not much fire. You can't really protect yourself. Our electric vehicles are such a good deal. You're going to buy them anyway. You can complain about it, but you're going to buy them. So we'll see, who wins on this trade battle. On Russia, in this issue of foreign affairs that I had a picture of, the most recent issue, there's an article by Stephen Kotkin on the 5 futures of Russia. I can't remember all the 5 scenarios, but the best scenario is if Russia eventually settles down into a kind of centralized. Is that for me? Thank you. What should I do with it? I have something. I'll save this. Russia has the potential, according to Kotkin, to become a kind of highly centralized bureaucratic state like France, but much bigger. But he doesn't think that's so likely. Russia has the potentiality to become a failed state as well. I don't think so. A little bit like this Thucydides trap. I think my position is that no country wants to be subordinated to another country, and that's certainly true of Russia. It's much too big. It has much too distinctive of a national identity. I'm not a Russian expert, right? There was a time when Russia was going to join Europe and become European. And I think it's just not, it just doesn't see itself as part of something else. It's too huge and it has a distinctive culture of its own. So absolutely, they're not going to be attracted, become Chinese in some sense. So I think the answer to your question is neither the United States nor China will attract Russia. Russia will always want to be a power of its own, but it doesn't have the economic size. It doesn't have the strategic location to fully fulfill that ambition.
On that pragmatic note, I think we can conclude. So please join me in thanking Professor Nathan for his lecture. And the good thing is that we don't say goodbye because we have him with us also tomorrow for another fascinating lecture on China's domestic politics. So see you tomorrow.